This lecture is the first in a series that will cover nearly 32,000 years in this course. And we begin in the Paleolithic period, or what is known as the Old Stone Age, when we have the emergence of representation in art. Now, the Paleolithic period is going to be an era where we find the emergence of representing things from the outside world, modifying materials around us to make them look like animals and generally women. Now, this is going to happen first in painting and sculpture because architecture is not going to be common until we get to the Neolithic period, or at least the Upper Paleolithic. The primary civil organization that we have at this time for humanity is a hunter-gatherer civilization, in which we have nomadic tribes living in small familial units moving across the land, beginning in Africa and making their way into Europe and Asia. Even though humanity can trace its roots going back 3 million years, the period where we see the rise of Homo sapiens sapiens, or our species, is going to be in the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age, when the technology our ancestors were using was primarily stone tools, which last until the end of the Pleistocene era. And this is going to be between 40,000 and 10,000 BCE, or before the Common Era. Now, in the Upper Paleolithic period, the end of the Paleolithic, we find that our ancestors, the third in a line of sapiens genus, is going to take over and dominate the world as we know it. Now, the construction of tools preceded the idea of art, for we have remnants of stone tools that were shaped by striking other harder stones against them, going back 3 million years to our previous ancestors that we can trace our lineage back to. These are entirely pragmatic tools to accomplish daily tasks such as hunting and or scraping hides, or making our lives more manageable. Now, when thinking of cavemen, we need to carefully differentiate them from an image we have in our minds of Neanderthals. Neanderthals are an entirely different species of genus of Homo entirely. And when our ancestors arrived at Western Europe from Africa, around again 40,000 BCE, beginning to migrate, we find that we are competing for the same food sources, and so we come out on top and eventually drive the Neanderthal extinct. Now, the story of representation for humans does not begin in Western Europe, where we find the major art museums are today. It begins in South Africa, in a cave called Apollo 11, where we find, for the first time, the move from finding an object that might look like something in nature to making something look like that ourselves, with representation, that is, presenting something again and anew to look like something else. And the most common subjects will be, in the Paleolithic period, women and animals. Now, these begin because we're talking about a nomadic culture that needs to be on the move. They need to be small and portable. So we find that most of these early images are going to be inscribed on stone plaques. So unlike the pebble that we discussed last class, which looks like a human face, but in fact was not shaped by a human being, instead slowly eroding over time in a stream, this would not be considered art, and so we do not discuss it in art history. An example of what would be considered art, and that we are covering in this class, is going to be found on a small 5-inch wide stone with charcoal drawn on it in Namibia. Here, in 23,000 BCE, we have in strict profile an animal, an indistinct and one that we cannot exactly identify, but we do know that it is a quadruped seen strictly in profile, which will remain common and standard for early man up until the Neolithic period. Now, this is the dominant subject at the outset of humanity in Africa. As we begin to move into Europe, it slowly changes. Now, we need to note at this time that when we say prehistory, we are literally referring to a period that is before history, which is the invention of writing and record keeping. So that's going to be around 3000 BCE. Now, we find that prehistoric as an adjective refers to cultural development, not time. So we actually have prehistoric cultures still in existence today in different parts of the world if they did not develop the written word and language that can be transcribed. Now, modern humans are going to spread across Africa, making their way around the Middle East and spreading into Europe, and then a part of our ancestors branched off and went into Asia. So we are going to make our way into Europe around 38,000 to 33,000 BCE. And as we move and settle in places like Hohensteinstadel, Willendorf, and Lascaux, we begin to slowly compete for the resources of the indigenous Neanderthal population and slowly supplant them. Now, the works we're going to be discussing here shortly would not be considered works of art by the humans that made them. Instead, they would be considered material culture, useful in their own right, either as talismans representing shamans, as fertility images, and or a means to control the world around us. We still have these images today in paintings of saints and or religious imagery, an attempt to control our world. Now, as we begin to eradicate the indigenous Neanderthal population, we do know that from DNA testing today that 30% of the current human population has a bit of Neanderthal in them. So we know that we did intermarry with that other species. Now, we will begin at Hohensteinstadel, where we have a very rare and early example of sculpture. In the lion human, named as such because we have a feline head with an anthropomorphic human body. In this example of a mammoth ivory, we have the tusk of a mammoth that has been cut off of the animal originally that it was on, and then very delicately carved to achieve this shape. So this is taken from woolly mammoths, showing that in fact our ancestors did eat and hunt these animals. And the difficulty of getting a hold of ivory shows how precious this material was to our ancestors and how much time they spent lavishing on sculpting it and making it look like something that it is not. It does not look like a tusk any longer. Now, this is a statuette, meaning a small statue, in this case about a foot high. Now, it is a composite creature, or chimera, combining multiple animals, in this case a human and a feline creature. It is carved by way of a burin, which is a pointed engraving tool in the process that we've discussed in subtractive sculpture. Now, we know this is very complex to create because here is an example of a prehistoric or Paleolithic burin, right, that would have been used. So it is merely a sharpened piece of stone that would be used to carve away section by section of ivory. Now, we must of course ask, what exactly is being represented here? And remember that we do not have the written record in prehistory, therefore we cannot verify exactly what early humans were thinking and wishing to communicate. So, as in anthropology today and archaeology, we look to similar cultures that have similar belief systems or material culture today. Now, we know that across the globe, even today, we have multiple cultures that have rituals involving animal skins. This can be found across the globe, from Asia to North America to South America to Europe. And the reasons why these cultures are going to have rituals with animal skins varies. But in general, it has to do with the ability to control one's environment by way of these animal forms and spirits. So the question then becomes, are we representing here a shaman or a religious leader in a village or small family unit wearing a lion mask as part of a ritual? We know that this is going to be common in many cultures, say in Inuit cultures of the American Northwest. Now, the latest theory is in fact that prehistoric humans did not actually differentiate themselves, right, from animals at all, but were considered all part of one common group, just different varieties in this way. Now, we find that this understanding of a religious leader adopting the qualities, characteristics, or power of a particular animal is understood in multiple cultures today, and in anthropology, a common understanding of magical efficacy. So is this in fact a man wearing a mask as part of a ritual? It could be. Now, the other variety of art that we find that is very common in the prehistoric era, and especially the Paleolithic era, is going to be that of nude women. Here we have the very famous and very tiny, it is only 4¼ inches high, Venus of Willendorf as part of the museum in Vienna. So here it is called the Venus of Willendorf because it is a nude female, unlikely representing a deity. It is merely representing someone who is nude, therefore it has been related to the goddess Aphrodite or Venus, the goddess of love and sex. Now, we call it the Woman of Willendorf today because it was found in the city of Willendorf outside of Austria. And in it we have a rather voluptuous woman that's going to be emphasizing her femininity and fecundity. So here we have a type that is common in prehistory that we refer to as a fertility image, that being an object that is meant to encourage conception and or fertility in a woman in a given tribe. Now, this is going to require the emphasis being placed on nude women. We very rarely see nude men in prehistory, so the focus is on making new life. And we're going to emphasize in these images what makes a woman different and unique. That being, we have very oversized and engorged breasts where her arms or her hands are going to be resting on top of them, if you can see them here. We have an emphasis placed on the hips, the large rotund belly, and then the inverted pubic triangle showing the vulva and distinctly pointing out that this is a woman. Now, the figure has no face, we must note, and no feet. Therefore, it lacks very specific features. Therefore, this probably did not represent a specific woman. Instead, a type, a fertile type. We find that this type can be found throughout Europe, from again France all the way to Russia. So this type with a woman without a face with very exaggerated feminine features and no feet are found all over. And so we must ask, what are they for? Or more importantly, who made them? A theory recently put forth by McDermott is going to state that these figures do not have feet because they are actually carved from the perspective of a pregnant woman. Therefore, we would generally assume that an exaggerated female form would be made by a man. But why hadn't we considered a woman carving these if they're going to be as part of a hunter-gatherer society, staying closer to the family unit and cave all the time? Now, Gamble, importantly, is going to argue that these sculptures, which are found across Europe, are going to be used to communicate friendly intentions between clans, or as part of intermarriages and fertility rituals, because obviously the time in which they were made is the last ice age. Therefore, this is a very harsh and unforgiving time and climate, which required humans to cooperate with one another to survive. You needed to align yourself strategically with other villages and family units near you. Now here is another variety of a female form, the woman from Bressempois. So here at Londres, France, we have at 30,000 BCE a very small 1.25 inch high memory image, which is to state it is a generalized human head formed from the characteristics we could remember of the human face, not looking at someone specifically, so not meant to be understood necessarily as a portrait. So here we have an abstract approach which reduces the shapes of the human face to basic recognizable forms, certainly not intended to be realistic. We do not have a mouth, we do not have eyes. Instead, we have a brow and a nose and a long neck. We also repeat a type of hair or headdress patterning over the head, which does look, interestingly enough, like certain patterns worn by certain peoples across the globe even today, with these woven units and or say in native customs in North America, having beads that are brought together over the head. It could represent either one. Now here we find that women are the dominant theme, but we should not understand these as portraits. Instead, they are going to represent the idea that early man and humanity has of women. And we are unsure of whether or not women are the actual authors and artists of these works. The other most common type and subject of art at the time is that of animals. Again, almost only ever shown in strict profile, such as the bison here from Le Touc in France. Here we have 2-foot-long animals representing bisons built up with additive sculpture. So the modeling and building them up, they would have brought in water to create a soft mud clay-like substance in order to show these animals from the side, making them easily identifiable. Of course, because the clay was not then fired, and when it slowly evaporated the moisture from within, it cracked. And you can see those cracks clearly visible on the backs and the sides here of these animals. Now here we find, just like in Apollo 11 cave, animals are shown in strict profile. Therefore we know with early humanity that originality and naturalism are going to be sacrificed for legibility, being able to identify what type of creatures these are. Whether or not they did so to make them clearly identifiable to other humans is unclear, but we do know that legibility is paramount for early man. Now here we have the entrance to Lascaux Cave, uncovered in 1940. Now this cave is one of the most famous prehistoric paintings in all of Western Europe. Now the cave, what is interesting here is that even though early man traveled to it for over 3,000 years, no one lived in it, for we have a lack of refuse in and near the cave. So we know that it was used, most likely for ritualistic purposes, intermittently, but we don't exactly know what those would have been. Now, obviously, if man is going to inhabit a cave, you must ask what would be left in it. And generally, you would find remnants of food scraps that were left uneaten, like bones, hide, etc. And then, once again, human waste, right, would also need to be disposed of. We do not have that here in this cave, therefore, we know it is not used primarily for living. But for over 3,000 years, between 15,000 and 12,000 BCE, humans returned to it time and again to add new paintings, generally of animals seen in profile across the walls. The largest area is known famously as the Hall of the Bulls, even though they are not representing all bulls and certainly not all the same species of animal. So here at Lascaux Cave, we're going to have the largest bull seen next to a human here to give you an idea of scale at 11 feet 6 inches long. Now, the animals are going to appear as though that they are a herd, appear as though that we're meant to read them at the same time, but they were painted by different people across a range of periods. So here, painted at different times, we need to realize that at this stage in human development, they cannot conceive of multiple figures in one narrative. They paint one object or subject at a time, so one bull at a time would have been painted. So now we read it as a narrative, but we know they do not have the capacity to do so as of yet. Now the animals you can see here are overpainted, illustrating that they are meant to be understood as individuals, not as part of a large group you would come across right in Western Europe at this time. Now the way in which they are presented, importantly, is going to be in composite view. So composite view here of this bull means that we are combining multiple viewing angles for maximum legibility to clearly identify what this animal is. And so for early man, what do they need to know if you're going to be looking at a bison or a bull? Well, they are quadrupeds, and so therefore we need to show all four legs. In addition to that, they have two horns. Therefore, very commonly moving forward, even up into ancient Egypt, we find that the horns are going to be seen as though from the front. But we combine that with the side of the head and profile. So it's as though we're looking at it in two combined views, so that we're communicating to people looking at this that we are representing an animal with four legs and two horns, so we can easily identify it. Now, how do we interpret these various animals painted on this wall? Well, traditionally, we find that the most common interpretation would be to try to control them in some mystical way as a food source. So, are we trying to assure the survival of the herds by painting them, showing that we want them to come back because they are going to be our sustenance? Are they our animal ancestors? It has been recently argued, and so we are venerating these creatures. Are these images, do they have magical properties? Do they have magical efficacy, the ability to control these animals in some way? Are they able to bring these beasts under our control by merely representing them? And we have this understanding in many cultures. If you can write something down or represent it, you control it. So think of voodoo. Now we have here the notion that perhaps they are painted as part of a ritual or a dance-like celebration. Are they teaching tools, for instance, or target practice for young hunters, so that fathers can help their children identify these animals for the hunt? Now, we have no idea exactly what they are used for, and the further complication is that many of these animals were not the primary food source for Paleolithic man. And so that debunks most of the theories that has to do with controlling the herds as part of food. Now, here we have another very interesting painting in what is known as the well. So in the bird-headed man with bison at Lascaux Cave, painted around 15,000 BCE, we have a bison that is going to be 3 feet and 8 inches across, giving you an idea of scale. So overall, the expanse of the entire forms here would be around 8 feet. What do we have but seemingly a bison who has been wounded and disemboweled with his intestines falling out to the right. We have a man with a bird head and an erect phallus showing that he is in fact male, next to a bird staff and a woolly rhinoceros running off seemingly to the left. So we find that each one of these items we know through carbon dating was painted at different times, but we still tend to read them as a narrative because we have developed the sense of storytelling since then. So we generally read this as a man who was hunting this bison, wounded it, and then was run over by this rhinoceros. So we do know that the notion of hunting is reinforced here because the bird-head man is going to have a staff with a bird on it, so hence a staff like a shaman, but he also is going to have an atlatl next to him, which is a device that amplifies the power and velocity with which you can throw a spear. So we do know that a weapon is present and an animal is wounded, so naturally we would often think of this as a story where a man wounded an animal. Now, is this in fact because we have again a man, very clearly with his genitalia showing, with the head of an animal? Is he a shaman? Is he a hero? We don't know what he exactly represents, but we certainly do today have cultures that would have certain headdresses that would make the wearer look like an animal or a bird. So think of Native American headdresses, for instance. Now we find that at this time most humans are going to live in cave shelters or small earthen huts, and they're going to move about. They are nomadic because they must go where the food is. They have not yet developed agriculture, and so therefore they're not staying in one place. You have to move if you want to live. Therefore, architecture is not going to be common until we get to the Upper Paleolithic period, from 15,000 to 10,000 BCE. This is when we find the beginnings of semi-permanent structures that foretell the village cities of the Neolithic period, where humans begin to stay longer and longer in one place until eventually we establish cities. So this is very common too, as you see here with the reconstruction of mammoth bone houses in the Ukraine, is going to be using the hides and bones of animals that were hunted at the time, which should remind you of the Native American teepee that was used in North America, which is going to have poles and generally buffalo hide that can be broken down and moved as, once again, the herds or whatever food source is being exploited to support a given tribe can also move. Next time, we will continue on with the development of these permanent cities and civilizations slowly with Neolithic art, as we see the slow rise of architecture, of building with stone, of large permanent structures.